I did bring a prop today for Pesach. Well, you'll see why in a little bit. Shelley actually challenged me as we were coming over to use dour as many times as I could in the sermon this morning. I don't think I'm going to be able to, but I would say that now is the hour to have our sermon. Maybe we'll find another place later on. I don't know. Well, if you looked at our Torah portion today, especially the parts towards the end, luckily we didn't actually talk about the death of Nadav and Abihu. We got to skip that this year. And instead, we talked about kashrut. And that's a really important subject, something that we think about and that we wonder about. And I was thinking about kashrut because I called to mind an event this morning when I was in Berlin just a few years before we left Tokyo. I had been invited to be part of a conference of Asian interfaith leaders. You know, I'm in Asia. I was sort of out of place a little bit because most of them were Asian, but I was the closest thing they could find to an Asian Jewish interfaith leader. So I came at this conference, and the first morning we were in a beautiful hotel in Berlin, and I went down for breakfast, and you can imagine a German buffet, exactly as you think. There were, most of the plates that were on the buffet were piled high with all sorts of kinds of breakfast meats. Now I get to miss all of that. So I don't remember what I had, maybe a scone, maybe some fruit, who knows, some yogurt, I don't know, I don't remember. But as I was eating, I noticed that there were a whole bunch of Buddhist monks that came down, all from Sri Lanka, from Cambodia, from Myanmar, all over Asia, Japan, and they were piling their plates high with this breakfast meat. Well, we assume in North America, by the way, that all Buddhists are vegetarian, and that's actually not true. And I had actually known that already, though I still was shocked. And so I was sitting with them, and they said, you Americans think that Buddhists are vegetarian. You also Americans think that Buddhists don't have any idea about gods. But you get us all wrong. Buddhism is far more complicated, they said, than you know about in America. And for most of us in Asia, we do eat meat. Because what the Buddha told us was, be mindful of what you eat, but he never said, don't eat X, Y, or Z. So they don't. They eat what they want. They're mindful of it, but they eat all sorts of different things. It's only in India, where Buddhists are very influenced by Jainism, that they don't eat a lot of these meats. And some of the Chinese Buddhists also don't eat meat. But most Asian Buddhists, no problem, bacon, sausage, who knows what. So I was wondering about and thinking about that idea of mindfulness. Because as we look at our Parsha today, we see that there's quite a lot about kashrut. There are no explanations given. And there are lots of animals we can eat, lots of animals we can't eat. And there are very strict categories about what we can eat and what we can't eat. And those strict categories are what anthropologists say help us to understand where these are coming from. That Judaism was a religion of categories. There were Jews and non-Jews. There were Kohanim and there were Israelites. There were kings and there were the rest of us. That Judaism, there was God and there was the world. That Judaism is a binary religion with categories, and you can't ever bridge between these categories. So, cloven hooves, good. Non-cloven hooves, bad. Cloven hooves actually and chewing their cud, good. Non-cloven hooves or not chewing their cud, or both not, bad. And all sorts, if you go through the list, it's all very strict. And the ones especially that come in the middle, where it might be confusing because they have one or the other of the things that are allowed, those are abominations. Now, it's not a surprise that Leviticus has lots about abomination, because Leviticus was a book written by priests, and priests love abominations. What you can do, what you can't do, spiritual purity, spiritual impurity, that's their business. Now, do these binary categories work for us? Not so well. And do the senses of abomination work for us? Not so well. So maybe thinking about the Buddhist category of mindfulness might help us to understand kashrut in a different way, but a way that's actually found in the text that can help us to understand why kashrut still is important. Now, before we get to that, did anybody notice the odd animal out that doesn't fit any of the categories and yet we can eat it? What? Locusts and other grasshoppers. So, can anybody guess why of all the animals, and it doesn't make anything sense, all the other swarming things, drafe, but locusts, they're okay, you can eat them. Why do you think? Cheryl? No, they're bad in the 10 plagues. Yes. What do you mean? Oh, there's so many of them, but there are lots of cicadas, or at least there will be this next week or two. In Japan, we got them every year. It was wonderful. So the abundance isn't a good enough reason. Yeah.
I always thought that once the locusts came and went, that's about all there is to eat.
That's exactly right. When the locusts came and went, they ate everything. Well, of the plants anyway. So if you wanted to eat the locusts. Our ancestors were nothing if not pragmatists. So what are the kinds of mindfulness that we can think about with kashrut, and then get to Pesach? You're still wondering what this is to do with Pesach, aren't you? So mindfulness, in thinking about kashrut, we have many, many different laws about kashrut. But the animal, when we think about the animals, what is it that we do when we go to the supermarket or we go to that buffet, and at the buffet we choose to eat a scone instead of the pile of bacon? Is it an abomination? Is it evil? Well, even in the Talmud, they knew that wasn't the case. So Rava, when talking about why you shouldn't eat bacon, and he wasn't probably talking about bacon, but more or less, he was saying, don't think that bacon is awful. Don't think that it's an abomination and evil. But the reason we don't do it is because God commands us, and we create holiness by following God's commands. So he says, do it because it's a mitzvah, because it creates a sense of holiness, not because there is anything wrong with it. Because Rava reminds us, even the bacon was created by God. So what is it about mindfulness when we eat? Well, we have the opportunity, when we choose to be kosher, to be mindful and turn something that effectively is an animal act into an act of kedusha, an act of holiness. We have a moment where we are thinking, we have to think about what we eat. When we're with friends, when we're at a restaurant, when we're at the supermarket, we have to think about what we eat. We have to be careful if we're kosher. And therefore, we are not just eating it because it's put in front of us, but we're eating it with a sense of holiness, with a sense of mitzvah. We have to be mindful about it. And that creates an opportunity for kedusha. It's not guaranteed. Most of the time we do it out of rote. But on the rare occasion, we think about, why am I eating this very hugely expensive turkey when I could spend a quarter of the price for a treif one? I'm doing it for a sense of kedusha, a sense of holiness. It makes you think about it, or it reminds us where the food comes from. As we think about the mitzvah, we remember that the food comes from God. It just doesn't miraculously appear on our plates. And therefore, we also think about God, we think about the nature and all the rains and things that are important for that food, and the farmer. We think about all of that, and it lends us a sense of responsibility and holiness. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important. It also can create a sense of community. As people share in these laws, makes it easier for us to eat together and helps to build a cohesiveness among the Jewish people, which also is very important. But what about those other categories of milk and meat and blood? Well, they have an even more profound sense of mindfulness and an opportunity for thought. And they are something that they very much in common. So the law in the Torah is you shall not eat a kid with its mother's milk, which we extend to eating any milk with meat. And if we think about that text, this is not a law about abomination. This is a law about life. The milk that we don't eat with meat, milk is the life source for every single mammal that exists in this world. Every mammal, when it's a baby, depends on milk. So milk gives it effectively life. Some say that that's what's meant by the idea of a land of milk and honey. So milk gives us life, and therefore it is an abomination, if you think about it, to eat that which gives us life with an animal we just killed, or at least the farmer or the butcher killed, and we're enjoying. So by separating the milk and meat, we say milk is a celebration of life, and though we are allowed to eat meat, we still remember that this was once a living creature nourished by milk, and therefore we don't touch it. Actually, do you know when we were given permission to eat meat?
As a compromise.
As a compromise when?
At the time of Noah.
Yeah, exactly. After the flood, Adam and Eve were told you rule over the world. They never were told, and that the plants are there for you to eat. They're never told they can eat meat. So eating meat is a compromise. It's not the ideal. But we need to think about it and take it seriously. So not eating the life substance is a way of taking that seriously and remembering the importance of life. And of course, does anybody remember Renfield's famous line in Dracula?
Of course.
What is it?
It's the first line anyone who practices.
What is it though, David, yeah?
The blood is the life.
Exactly. Blood is the life. So blood also, where would we be without our blood? So if you think about it, it's the most important thing that flows through us. It keeps us alive, well, one of the important things. So blood is the life. That's a reminder to us that blood, we don't eat blood again, because blood symbolizes that which gives us life, and therefore, to eat it after we've killed the animal, therefore, we show respect and we show reverence for life by abstaining from eating the blood with the meat. So kashrut is this reminder to us and this opportunity to think about holiness, to think about where the food comes from, to think about what it means to live in relationship with God. But it's also a time when we can have reverence for life and remember that God gave us, but God also gave the animals life and needs to be respected. So this week, though, is Shabbat HaChodesh, and we also talked about food in the section of Torah that Ben read, not so much in what Barbara read. And Ben was telling us about the cow or the animal, the goat or the sheep that was going to be sacrificed for Pesach. And we're told you take it, you put it aside on the lamb. It's a lamb on Pesach. You take it, you put it aside the first day of the month of Nisan, and then on the 14th day you sacrifice it, and you got to eat it. And not only eat it, you eat it in a hurry. And so there we have that. But we also, in the section that Ben read, we talk about other things about food. The most difficult part of Pesach, which is abstaining from the chametz. Now, the chametz gives us a very, very different message. The lamb reminds us about freedom. The lamb reminds us of the blood that was placed on the doors. It reminds us that we're celebrating freedom and we're celebrating leaving Egypt. Now, does anybody know, by the way, how many times the Israelites celebrated Pesach from this first Pesach we read about today until they got to Eretz Yisrael? David, I can't answer every question. Anybody want to guess?
41.
41. No, it was twice. They only celebrated, for some reason, they never celebrated Pesach in the desert. So they do it this week we read about the commands for it, and the next time they do it, it's in the book of Joshua. So who knows why? But it was too difficult maybe in the desert to do it. But the sheep, the lamb that we sacrifice, that reminds us of freedom. And the blood reminds us of freedom. But what about the chametz? Well, the rabbis tell us that the chametz reminds us that we are all imperfect human beings. We're not ready at every moment to enter into freedom. And that's why during Pesach, we actually need 6 weeks to prepare for Pesach. For Easter, they only need a month. For Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we only need a month. But for Pesach, we have special portions read, 4 special portions that cover 6 weeks generally before Pesach. Because that reminds us that getting ready for freedom is not easy. And one of those, Shabbat Zachor, reminds us that there is evil within each of us, and we have to not only make sure we remember it, but wipe out its memory, try to remove the evil from us. And Chametz, according to the mystics, is exactly the same. That the Chametz that we remove from our houses are the imperfections and the evils that are within each of our souls. And to move towards redemption, to move towards freedom, we need to cleanse ourselves. We need to spend these 6 weeks getting ready. And then, of course, on Pesach, we remove it from our houses saying, we've done it. We're ready. We're ready to be free. And then we go to our regular lives after Pesach, because maybe we didn't do quite a good enough job this year. But at the end of Pesach, we do hope next year, maybe we'll clean ourselves of our chametz really well, and all of us will be free. So when you're cleaning your houses this year, getting rid of all your chametz, think about all those imperfections. Each box of chametz should be a different imperfection, and get rid of all of them. Actually get rid of them from your soul, and maybe next year we'll be in Jerusalem. Who knows? We can at least try. Now, what about our palm branch? So, of course, what is this? It's our lulav from Sukkot. Now, when I was a medieval history major when I was in university, and one of the things we were studying was the origins of some of the Christian practices, especially in the Middle Ages, because that's what you do when you're a medieval history major. And so we were looking at Palm Sunday. So Palm Sunday probably actually happened on Sukkot. Because of course, when do you wave palm branches and say Hosanna? Hosanna, Hosanna. You do it on Sukkot. So many scholars think that the new Christian scriptures compacted the events of Jesus' life. They had Sukkot with Palm Sunday, and then he was in Jerusalem probably till Pesach. And so they pushed it all together because they wanted to keep the story short. But on Palm Sunday, you wave the branches. But a few weeks before that, there's an event called Ash Wednesday. And on Ash Wednesday, they put ashes on your forehead. You've probably seen people, mostly Catholics and Orthodox Christians, with the little cross on their heads on Ash Wednesday. I remember in New York City, you'd come through, there would be priests in Grand Central Station doing it. I never got tempted, but they were there. Did you ever wonder, I wondered, what did they make the ashes out of for Ash Wednesday? And do you know what they did? They took the palms from the last year's Palm Sunday and they burned them, and that's the source of Ash Wednesday. So way back when I was this young student, last year sometime, when I was in college, I did a paper thinking about looking at Jewish community in Spain and in Provence and the Christian communities, and thinking about the cross-pollination between Judaism and Christianity at that time, which was coming into vogue. And it was really very powerful because almost all the Greek texts that we think of today, Plato, Aristotle, and all of the like, they were preserved in the Arab world, and then they came into Europe during the Crusades through the Jewish community in Provence, translated then into Hebrew and then into Arab, and then into Latin. So, and there was lots of movement back and forth. So I wondered, because I knew about this custom, was there a Jewish cognate for this custom? And I found there was one. So, so they burn ashes on the palm branches on Ash Wednesday. So can anybody think about when we burn something on and around Pesach? We burn the chametz. And there is a custom that's called bedikat chametz. Especially good for, I saw some grandchildren here today, and there are lots of children outside, so something to think about. But Bedikat Chametz is a great custom. You take, generally, a wooden spoon, a candle, or today most people probably use flashlights, and a feather, and the parents, after the house has been totally clean from chametz, you usually put a few bags of chametz around the house, and the kids go searching for it. It's usually candy or something like that, and with some bread, and the kids get to eat the candy, but they then find using the flashlights or the candle. When I grew up, it was candles, much better. They would sweep the chametz onto the wooden spoon, put it in a place, and then the next morning, just before 10 o'clock, you burn it and say, as I burn this chametz, there is no more chametz in my house. And by the way, you also burn the wooden spoon and the feather because they're now chametz. But in medieval Provence, I found a text in one of the early commentaries on Sukkot, and in that community, what they would do is they would save the lulav from Sukkot, and they would keep it until just before Pesach, and they wouldn't use a feather, but they used the lulav to sweep the chametz into their, probably not a wooden spoon, it would be probably pretty difficult with a lulav, and then they would burn the lulav and whatever else just before Pesach as they prepared for Pesach. So it was an interesting congruence between our custom and the Christian custom that were concurrent. And of course, if you think about it, there's so much between our religions that are very similar. Another wonderful one, this is totally an aside, but I'm going to share it anyway, that Purim, it used to be traditional that the most foolish person in the community would be the rabbi for the day. Probably they did a better job than the rabbis. But in medieval Europe, at the same time, they didn't have Purim, of course, but they did have the beginning of Lent was Mardi Gras or some other event like that. And that was a day when it was customary for the court jester to be the king for the day. So I've been wondering if those things are related. That one would be harder to tie together. But let's think about Pesach as we prepare. Let's think about what we eat and make it a holy action. Let's think about what we eat and celebrate life. And as we celebrate Pesach, and as we collect our chametz especially, as we sweep it into our wooden spoons with our palm branches, let's think about not only physically removing the chametz from our houses, but removing that chametz, that leaven that's in our soul that prevents us from actually achieving freedom, that actually is preventing us from achieving redemption. Shabbat Shalom.